Sustainable Development Goals now to ESG, right? Environment, sustainability, and governance. We're really good at kind of new acronyms and new buzzwords. But there is some underlying logic to it that back in the late 80s, early 90s, what
Hi everyone, welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk series brought to you by AKFI Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry association committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. Actionable ESG Talk series brings together great minds to together discuss the current state and the future state of ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. Today we have Stu join us as the guest speaker. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. Yeah, and my name is Isabella. I am the co-host and here with another co-host, Manuel, also the executive director at the AKFI. Stu is the Samuel C. Johnson Chair Emeritus in Sustainability, Global Enterprise, and Professor of Management at the Cornell University's Johnson School of Management. And he also recently published a book called Beyond Shareholder Primacy, Remarking Capitalism for a Sustainable Future. It's just 2024. When? Which month? This
Came out in
month?
April.
April. Wow, very recent. And we're gonna talk about it for sure. And it's a call to consciousness and action for individuals, organizations, communities, and nations. Very look forward to hear about that. And Professor Hart also it's one of the world's top authorities on the implications of environment and poverty for business strategy. Welcome again. Let's dive into the discussion today. What's the shareholder capitalism? You had this book and you've been talking about it. And how do you see it manifest in our society today?
Yeah, so shareholder capitalism is our current reality, right? And has been for the last, going 40-ish years, thereabouts. But it's not forever. It hasn't always been this way. Shareholder capitalism is a particular operating system. That's a good way to think about it, particular operating system for capitalism. There have been others, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let me sketch what I think are the kind of the core aspects or core elements that define shareholder capitalism. First and foremost, shareholder capitalism is defined by profit maximization and the driving of shareholder value by profit maximization as the primary purpose of business, right? And a lot of people go back and pin it to Milton Friedman in the 70s and so forth, and certainly he had a lot to do with it. But there have been many other contributing factors, including agency theory and a variety of other sort of both academic and sort of world of practice elements that have driven this way of thinking about business, where success and purpose is defined by maximizing shareholder value. Shareholder value is maximized by quarterly earnings growth, and quarterly earnings growth is maximized by tying executive compensation to share price, right? And that becomes kind of a virtuous circle. Now, in order to achieve that, right, that given that quarterly earnings growth and profitability is the prime driver of share price under shareholder capitalism, then there are lots of other kind of associated elements like wherever possible, extracting resources at little or no cost, or externalizing negative impacts, or reducing expenses generally, which would include, kind of workers, labor, and the people side of the company, right, which would be considered expenses. And also, to the extent possible, deregulation in order to minimize costs, since the objective really is to maximize the profitability of the business in order to drive share price. And then an added kicker would be driving share price in the short term can be achieved by devoting much of that profit earned by the company not to reinvestment in the business so much as buying back the stock in order to goose the stock price even more in the short term. So share buybacks, I think have become one of the defining features of shareholder capitalism. The net effect of all this, of course, is that it tends to widen the wealth divide, right? Because a minority of people actually own stock, right? Like 10% of the people own 90% of the stock. So when the stock market goes up, then the wealthy comparatively get richer. Uh, CEO comp now has reached absurd levels where it's, 300 to 400 times the average worker, whereas, only 50 years ago, it was more like 30. So it widens the income divide as well in a rather significant way. And then, the logic of cost cutting, externalization, deregulation contributes, in a significant way to, and the externalization of negative impacts to, the climate crisis that's emerging, carbon emissions, plastic waste, ecosystem degradation, all the various other environmental problems that we've been experiencing. So, shareholder capitalism kind of has been the operating system coming from the United States experience by and large. It's sort of an American phenomenon, but given the U.S.'s incredible influence on the rest of the world, that way of thinking, while it hasn't taken over the world entirely, has spread in a significant way to the entire world.
Thank you very much, Stu. And uh, I'm pondering in my mind if we shouldn't rename it actually share maximization capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism, which seems to be the theme.
Yeah, shareholder first capitalism and share maximization, but share maximization defined as driven by profit maximization and quarterly earnings growth, right? That if other
Financialization.
aspects, we'll talk about this more, but if other aspects were the driver of share price, then share maximization wouldn't be so bad.
That's true. That's absolutely true. But is the element of financialization actually
Right.
of the
Financialization, another important element of shareholder capitalism, because given everything that I've just said, it shouldn't be surprising that the value of financial assets has swollen right over the last 30 or 40 years. That if you compare the value of financial assets, kind of stocks, bonds, and so forth, in other words, kind of held capital assets that have yet to be turned into cash, then the value of those now is 5 or 6 times GDP, right? Kind of the income side of things, right? Whereas 50 years ago, those were about equal, right? Kind of the value of GDP to financial assets were about equal. Now financial assets are 5x, right? So, and most of the people that possess the financial assets are the wealthy. Again, another element of driving income inequality and wealth inequality.
Oh, very interesting. But I would like to take you about 20 years back with your permission and take you to the first book, right? The Capitalism at the Crossroads, and bring you now forward in looking at the Beyond the Short Shareholder Primacy book and remaking of the capitalism for a sustainable future. How one builds on the other? How do you see 20 years ago now, today?
Yeah, yeah. Even we could even push it back 30 years, let's say, and
Let's do it.
yeah, because I've been kind of having at this that long, right? And if I think back to say the late 80s, early 90s, when sort of the current thinking on sustainable business first began to emerge, the logic was, back then it was called, EHS. We're really good at kind of alphabet soup. We've gone from EHS, which is environment, health, and safety, to the SDGs, which are the Sustainable Development Goals, now to ESG, right? Environment, sustainability, and governance. We're really good at kind of new acronyms and new buzzwords. But there is some underlying logic to it that back in the late 80s, early 90s, what put sustainable business on the map was the idea of eco-efficiency. The idea that we can actually reduce emissions, reduce waste, and thereby reduce risk and reduce cost at the same time, right? That's what made it business relevant, right? But before then, issues around environment and sustainability were not really considered relevant to business, right? That these were problems for engineers and public policy people. But eco-efficiency made it relevant, and that's when I first was able to bring, and others to bring this topic into business schools, right? I joined the faculty at the University of Michigan Business School in 1985, right? And that was in that time frame when eco-efficiency first made it relevant. So the early days were all about that, and it was about contributing to shareholder value, right? That, hey, if we just engage in pollution prevention and eco-efficiency, it'll actually cut costs and reduce risk, and we'll make more money. So the original logic, and really I would say up until now, of sustainability, of and the book Capitalism at the Crossroads came out 20 years ago or thereabouts. But I wrote another piece in 1997 that was published in Harvard Business Review with the title Beyond Greening: Strategies for a Sustainable World. That was 1997, where I was able to kind of draw the distinction between what I call greening, right, which is eco-efficiency, waste reduction, pollution prevention, and then, kind of extending that to product stewardship, that we ought to be thinking about where the raw materials come from, what happens to the product, and, the impact of the product in use, what happens to the product at the end of its useful life. Think of that as product stewardship. Those are greening strategies because they're about reducing the negative impacts of current products and processes. Whereas beyond greening, as I talked about it, even back then, was about leapfrogging to next generation technology rather than just, reducing the negative impact. How do we get to a more positive impact in the world by getting to inherently clean and regenerative technology and using the power of business to create, open up, serve the underserved, create new markets among those who have been left out, kind of the notion of serving the base of the income pyramid. That's the beyond greening agenda. But I think it's fair to say here we are now 25 plus years later. And while there's been lots of discussion about the beyond greening agenda, we're still pretty much stuck in greening, right? And so it became evident to me around, as we kind of wore into the second decade of the 21st century, that, this just wasn't getting us there, right? The kind of the sustainable business agenda, which was all about contributing to the shareholder value way of thinking, right? That it was making the business case for sustainability. That was the mantra. Wasn't getting us there because the only business case you can make is one of reducing negative impact for current products and processes. The beyond greening agenda requires a longer term perspective, and that goes against the logic of shareholder primacy. So it became increasingly evident to me that the problem was shareholder primacy, and that as long as capitalism was run with those ground rules, as an operating system, we were never going to realize the kind of transformative change that was necessary. The dials of the global dashboard were continuing and still are continuing to head in the wrong direction. Inequality still increasing, climate change turning into more of a crisis, the sixth extinction progressing even more rapidly. So it became evident to me that it was necessary for us to think about how, as business people, we pay attention to the larger operating system of capitalism itself, what these days is people talk about in terms of system change.
Very, very interesting. And I have multiple threads. A very short one, together with a professor from we co-author a white paper that targets actually the processes of designing, and the process of designing starts with a market requirement documents. Usually, it's called in the high tech industry at least, and we rename it an SMRD, as Sustainable Market Requirement Documents, because it has to start from the beginning. You can put sustainability at the end of the process, as you mentioned, right? Like change current products. You have to think sustainable from day one. You also pointed out actually to the shareholder capitalism. Of course, that's one of the main threats today. And if I think about it, it's simplistically, you can say divide the world in have and have nots, have shares or they have not shares. And it assumes that people that don't have shares, they're not interested at all in the company, besides being maybe consumer of the product. So it's a very, clear-cut definition between people that are interested in the company and people that shouldn't be interested because they are not shareholders.
Right. And in many cases, that's the rank and file of people that work at companies, right?
Absolutely.
Are not shareholders. Whereas, the largest shareholders of companies are people that have nothing whatsoever to do with the company.
Right. And let's not touch today the daily traders because that's a different category of shareholders.
Right.
But going back to AKFI, our mission is to bridge the gap between digital transformation and sustainability. And you already mentioned AI and machine learning and technology in today. And just to emphasize what you already said, the stakeholder capitalists should include technology. You mentioned it, and maybe you go back and give us a little bit more insight.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would put, AI, and I'm certainly no expert, right, in AI or machine learning, but I would put it in the same category among those enabling technologies that can be transformative, right? That along with, leaping to renewable energy and a bio-based economy and so forth. It's an enabling technology, and certainly for entrepreneurs, generative AI and machine learning can be a blessing, right? Because in general, right, that's the case, because it can assist with a variety of tasks that entrepreneurs have to undertake, where it's difficult for entrepreneurs to be expert at everything, right? AI and machine learning can be greatly beneficial, I think, just in general. But if I think about it in the sustainability space, increasingly I see the application of AI and machine learning to things like, for example, if companies are committing to 2050 net zero goals, so many of them are just simply like post-it notes on the wall without any meaningful pathway or set of strategies or initiatives to actually get there, because as a senior executive, you can put that post-it note on the wall and claim that you're being sustainable, when
Yeah.
that that's way beyond not only your tenure but maybe your life. So so but increasingly what I see are entrepreneurs beginning to create companies, one of which I've gotten involved with. It's a company called Vizard, which is very interesting, where they're able to apply AI to helping senior management of companies think through, by loading all of those data, both the stuff you can scrape off the web already, like the raters do, but also working with senior management to access internal management data, along with scenarios about the future, to actually then play out sequences of strategies for getting to net zero, right? That AI and machine learning can be enormously beneficial in not only helping to think those through and chart different pathways using different scenarios, but also kind of putting on the ground very practical sequences of actions and investments that need to be made.
That sounds very interesting. And not long ago, a little company called Google, or Alphabet, if you want,
Yeah.
announced that rethinking their net zero strategy. They were buying carbon credits at the time, and they thought that it's sort of like abolition of sins,
Well,
buying credits.
the whole carbon credit thing, I think, has been exposed, for the somewhat fraud that it is, right? So many carbon credits really are really just sham kind of investments that don't produce real results. So increasingly, I think the pressure is toward actual carbon reduction, not just carbon credits, which may or may not actually produce long-term results when it comes to carbon. And I think there's also a game that a lot of companies play, where they will put on the wall a net zero goal, but it's only what's called scope 1 and 2, or it's only their direct emissions. When the big impact is really what they do in the world, right? Whether it's the petroleum industry or whatever it might be. And and then to use credits basically to cover themselves even on scope 1 and 2. So there's a lot of game playing that goes on while Rome burns.
Oh, that's so true. And you mentioned also conscious capitalism or conscience part of that, and you mentioned also the source code of capitalism. So I'm very curious, and I'm sure Isabella also may have some questions around the conscious capitalism and your views about it, how it relates to stakeholder capitalism.
Well, the idea of the source code, right, is, one of the things that I was motivated by, that, as I mentioned before, as it got to be like 2015, 16, 17, I was becoming increasingly disenchanted with, just the work that I'd done for the last 25 years on sustainable business, not getting us there. I was motivated to understand how is it that we got to this place, right? How do we end up in this predicament? And that led me to a fairly deep dive. I'm not a trained historian, but read widely and deeply in history, like looking back 400 or 500 years. What was the origin story of capitalism? Where did it start, and how has it evolved over the last 4 or 5 centuries? And one of the things that became evident was, that the idea of corporations and what we would think of as the practices of capitalism really didn't exist before the 1600s, right? That was really the source code. It was the mercantilist age, it was the trading companies, kind of the British and Dutch trading companies that was the genesis. That's the source code. Take the British East India Company, right, founded in 1600. Its sole purpose was to maximize profits for the shareholders. It was the first joint stock limited liability corporation funded with private equity, called at the time adventure capital. That's what it was called. So, and its practices were to basically go extract resources wherever they could, in India, in the Spice Islands, and then in the New World. Well, it started in the west coast of Africa, kind of raiding and slaving expeditions. That's where the so-called explorers learned how that's how their business model got established. But then that was extended, right, to certainly to India in the case of the British East India Company, where over the course of 200 or 300 years, they hollowed India out entirely. Right, India in the year 1600 was accounted for 25% of the world GDP. They were a manufacturing juggernaut like China. China and India were 50% of the world GDP in 1600. India was a tiny backwater. But as the Industrial Revolution progressed, right, and you were able then to make textiles more cheaply using machines, that then allowed them to move from acquiring wherever they could finished product from India and selling it in Great Britain and in America, to actually just expropriating cotton wherever they could, making cheaper textiles, selling it back to the Indians, and hollowing out their entire industry and impoverishing the country in the process. They were well on the path to doing that in the New World too, until the Americans got the idea that maybe this wasn't such a great idea, and along came the American Revolution. And what was the intellectual force behind that what I call capitalist reformation, right? Because history has been a series of capitalist overreach, excess, extraction, so forth, and then a counter movement to try to put it back in the box. And that's really what the American Revolution was. And the intellectual force behind that was none other than Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment. If you go back and read Adam Smith, which I've done, both, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, you will quickly realize that he was the world's first anti-corporate activist. He railed against the trading companies as monopolist practices, as extractive practices. He was anti-slavery. He viewed what was going on in the New World as an aberration. He was all about small companies competing against each other, such that no player could control price. That was really the idea of the market economy, and it was in direct contravention to the monopolistic practices of the trading companies. He of course thought that businesses needed to make a profit, right? That's obvious, right? As capitalists, you have to make a profit. But his view was that the idea of accumulating profit and extracting profit in the hands of a few, business owners was a mortal sin, right? He railed against the idea of business owners extracting wealth from the company and using it to buy what he called baubles and trinkets, right? It was profit was for reinvesting back in the business so that you could grow the business, employ more people, and raise the commonwealth. He was motivated by the idea of virtue from the Greeks and the Romans, right? That as business people, you need to behave with virtue, and that means pursuit of the common good. The Americans were greatly influenced by this kind of thinking. And when they founded the new country, they controlled corporations. That's why there's no such thing as a national corporation in America, right? Corporations can only be incorporated at the state level because the last thing they wanted was another British East India Company, controlled by the crown. So corporations in the early days of the American Republic were only incorporated at the state level, had to remain within one state for a defined period of time for a specific public purpose. So there was what we would think of as a real capitalist reformation that occurred. Now that was gradually eroded over the course of the 19th century as the railroads grew, demanded more capital, and then the Industrial Revolution, right, with steel and oil and so forth. Those restrictions were gradually eroded away, and we ended up with a Gilded Age. And another round of concentration, kind of wealth disparity, environmental degradation. The labor movement arose at that point in time, right? Only to see another reformation come with the progressive era in America, right? Which resulted then, through the Great Depression and into the 30s, coming out of that with a form of capitalist, we'll call it an operating system. That was really what the capitalists at the time in the 50s and 60s called welfare capitalism, right? The purpose of the corporation when I was a kid growing up in America was to build the middle class, right? And that's what happened, right? It was about promotion ladders and pay and building a middle class. That's when the middle class got built in America, right? It was, and of course, America corporations could afford it at that point. After the Second World War, Japan and Europe were in ashes. It was the only game in town. But still, the point is, it was a very different operating system with significant blind spots like environment, women, race, but still the point of the company, the objective function of the company was very different. Only to see that revert once again to the original sort of British East India Company mercantilist mentality in the 70s with the rise of shareholder capitalism. This is the third time we've seen capitalism revert to form, going back to the mercantilist age, where the sole purpose is to maximize profit for the investors in the short term. And what I believe, what we are in the midst of now is the third capitalist reformation. That's what the sustainability movement is all about.
I, I cannot stop the question of asking, will it be conscious? Are we going to revert back to Adam Smith and to moral society?
I think
And I'm thinking of companies which are now in the trillions of dollars. I don't know, if you ask me to write the number of zeros, it'll take me some thinking
right.
just to.
But I think that is part and parcel, right? So I mean the whole idea of purpose, the whole idea of conscious capitalism I think are echoes, are rhymes with, the thinking of somebody like Adam Smith, who believed in the idea of virtuous, right? That capitalists, and even call it capitalism as a term of art, didn't exist until the 19th century. But, the idea of a market economy was premised on the idea of virtuous behavior by the market participants.
Very interesting, very interesting. And I know Isabella is spending quite a lot of time thinking about that and trying to put together the future for us.